Imagine a time when war was not only brutal but lawless. A time when the wounded were abandoned on the battlefield, bleeding under the sun, calling out in vain. No matter which uniform they wore, they faced the same fate: neglect. There were no rules to protect them, no aid to comfort them, and no guarantee of survival once the fighting stopped. Now imagine a single moment that began to change all of that. A moment not of gunfire, but of resolve. This is the story of the First Geneva Conference of 1864, the meeting that gave birth to international humanitarian law and the global symbol of compassion. The Red Cross. To understand the importance of this moment, we must travel back to the mid-19th century. Europe was a continent constantly shifting between diplomacy and destruction. Wars were frequent, armies massive, and casualties staggering. Yet, while weapons evolved, muskets replaced with rifles, horses with railroads, the treatment of the wounded remained archaic. Medical services on the battlefield were primitive at best. Most wounded soldiers were left behind after battle, lying in pain, sometimes for days. Infection, dehydration, and exposure killed more men than bullets did. A defining moment in this dark chapter came during the Battle of Solferino, fought in northern Italy in June of 1859. Two great empires clashed: the Austrian Empire and the alliance of France and the Kingdom of Sardinia. The result? A bloodbath. Nearly 40,000 casualties in a single day, many of them left where they fell. But among the chaos was an unlikely witness, a Swiss businessman named Henry Dunant. He was traveling for a business deal, but what he encountered on that battlefield would haunt him forever. Rather than turn away, Dunant took action. He convinced villagers to help him care for the wounded, regardless of which side they fought for. He tore up sheets to make bandages. He brought water to dying men. And as he worked, one phrase became his rallying cry: Tutti fratelli, we are all brothers. That simple idea that humanity does not vanish in war became the seed of a revolution. 2 years later, Dunant published a powerful book, A Memory of Solferino. It wasn't just a recounting of war, it was a challenge to the world. He proposed the creation of neutral volunteer organizations that could care for the wounded during armed conflict, protected by international law and marked by a single, universal symbol. His vision was bold, idealistic, and impossible to ignore. In 1863, Dunant's idea found its champions in a group of Swiss citizens who formed what would become the International Committee of the Red Cross. Among them were doctors, lawyers, and soldiers, people who knew the cost of war. They shared a belief that compassion should not be seen as weakness, but as strength. But ideals needed law. That's where the First Geneva Conference came in. The goal was unprecedented: gather world powers to agree on basic humanitarian rules for war. And so, in August 1864, 12 nations met in Geneva, Switzerland. Among them, France, Prussia, Austria, Italy, and even the Ottoman Empire. Notably, many of these countries had been at war with each other in recent memory. Yet here they were talking peace in the language of law. The result of that meeting was historic: the First Geneva Convention. It wasn't perfect. It was short, just 10 articles, but its principles were groundbreaking. The wounded must be protected and cared for, regardless of nationality. Field hospitals, medical transport, and aid workers must be respected as neutral. And a distinct emblem, the Red Cross on a white background, would mark all humanitarian missions. The symbol, by the way, was chosen as a reverse of the Swiss flag, not only to honor the birthplace of the idea, but to symbolize neutrality, clarity, and humanity. Later, the Red Crescent and Red Crystal would be added to accommodate cultural and religious diversity. But the First Geneva Convention was more than ink on paper. It was a new moral compass in the conduct of war. Let me pause here to ask, what made this so revolutionary? Well, for the first time in history, a national law recognized that even in war, there are limits, that dignity and mercy could be protected alongside national interests. This wasn't just humanitarian, it was strategic. Soldiers who knew they would not be abandoned were more willing to fight. Armies that respected humanitarian law earned global respect. And perhaps most importantly, a line had been drawn. It's easy to forget how radical this was in the 19th century. Until then, war had followed the law of the victor. The Geneva Convention introduced the law of shared humanity. The 1864 Geneva Convention was signed, but would it work in practice? The answer came quickly. In the decades that followed, new conflicts erupted across Europe and beyond. The Franco-Prussian War, 1870–1871, became the first major test of the Convention's principles. For the first time, medical teams entered the battlefield under the Red Cross emblem. Wounded soldiers, once ignored or even executed by the enemy, were now being treated often by volunteers from neutral countries. The idea of neutral humanitarian aid was no longer a theory. It was saving lives, but as warfare evolved, so did the need for more comprehensive protection. The original convention dealt mainly with land warfare and wounded soldiers. Soon, new challenges emerged: prisoners of war, civilians in occupied territories, and eventually, airborne attacks and naval warfare. These would lead to new versions of the Geneva Conventions, updated in 1906, 1929, and most significantly, in 1949. Following the horrors of World War II, let's pause on that moment. World War II, a war that redefined the scale of suffering. Tens of millions dead, entire populations displaced, civilians targeted, concentration camps, atomic bombs, and yet, amid the carnage, the International Committee of the Red Cross ICRC continued its mission. From delivering messages between families torn apart by conflict, to visiting prisoners of war in Nazi camps and Japanese detention centers, the Red Cross became a lifeline, sometimes the only one for millions. But even the Red Cross faced moral dilemmas. In Nazi Germany, for instance, the ICRC was criticized for not speaking out more forcefully against the Holocaust. These ethical struggles would shape the future of humanitarian organizations, raising questions that are still debated today. When does neutrality become complicity? When does silence protect? And when does it harm? These are not easy questions, but they highlight something crucial. The Geneva Conventions are not just legal texts, they are living principles, constantly tested by the changing nature of war. In 1949, in response to the devastation of the Geneva Conventions were fundamentally expanded. 4 treaties were established: protection of wounded and sick soldiers on land, protection of wounded and sick at sea, treatment of prisoners of war, protection of civilians, especially in occupied territories. For the first time, civilians became central to international humanitarian law. Hospitals, schools, and refugee camps could no longer be considered fair targets, and attacks against them were recognized as war crimes. This legal framework now forms the core of what we call international humanitarian law, a system of rules respected by nearly every nation on earth. It informs modern tribunals, like those in Nuremberg, Rwanda, and The Hague, where war criminals are held accountable. And yet, challenges persist. In today's world, war looks different. Cyber attacks, drone strikes, civil wars with no clear front lines, non-state actors, terrorist groups, proxy wars. These new dynamics test the Geneva Conventions in unprecedented ways. How do you apply international law when the enemy is a decentralized network rather than a nation-state? How do you enforce neutrality when aid workers themselves become targets? Despite this, the spirit of the First Geneva Conference lives on. Every day, thousands of Red Cross and Red Crescent volunteers work in the world's most dangerous places: Syria, Sudan, Ukraine, Gaza, bringing food, water, shelter, and dignity to those caught in conflict. Their presence is a direct legacy of that 1864 meeting in a quiet Swiss city. And Henry Dunant, though he faced hardship later in life, falling into debt and obscurity, his contribution was never forgotten. In 1901, he became the very first recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. He shared the award with Frédéric Passy, pioneer of the peace movement. Dunant died in 1910, but his vision of organized, compassionate response to human suffering remains one of the most impactful humanitarian ideas in history. Today, over 190 countries are parties to the Geneva Conventions. The Red Cross emblem, along with the Red Crescent and Red Crystal, are recognized around the world as symbols of hope and neutrality, even in the worst conditions. Think about that for a moment. In a chaotic battlefield, amid gunfire and destruction, a simple red cross on a white field still holds power. It signals safety, humanity, and a promise: you are not alone. That's the legacy of the First Geneva Conference. The 1864 conference was not about politics or territory. It was about people, about recognizing that war may be inevitable, but suffering doesn't have to be. It was the beginning of a moral code shared across nations, one that dares to place human dignity above the chaos of conflict. If you found this journey meaningful, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories that shaped our world. And if you'd like to continue exploring the moments when humanity chose compassion over cruelty, click the next video on your screen now. Thank you for listening, and remember, even in times of war, humanity has a voice, and it began in Geneva.